a nice comfortable roll.
Okay, so that was Lebanon. Now you're looking at Syria. So a couple things just so you have your bearings. You see that white road there? It goes like that, and then it cuts this way. It's like an L. So that's the border. It cuts this way and then goes that way up to the Ramon. To the right, see that cluster of buildings at the corner? That's the UN Demilitarized Observation Force, which means basically they watch Netflix and criticize Israel. So that's pretty much what that is, more or less. What you're looking at in front of you is Quneitra. This big city, well, I shouldn't say big city, this little town over here is a Syrian village, New Quneitra. This is what's called Old Quneitra. I'll spare you the Arabic names, but that's more or less what it is. See that quarry behind the windmills? There's a village just behind it. You see the tiny little village behind the quarry? That's a place called Jabata el Khashab. That's the first place that kicked the regime out fully in the Syrian revolution when it began. So the revolution began south of here in a place called Dara. That's where it began, but that was the first place that the regime got fully kicked out of. Also became the first place that the Israeli army brokered a strategic relationship with the opposition forces to become friends. So from there, what's called Operation Good Neighbor grew, was out of that village. That was the first village that we put FAI personnel into. It's a tiny, tiny little rural, very poor village, but that became kind of the symbol of the revolution, is that little village from a Syrian perspective, because they were farmers and it's a very poor, very difficult place to live, and that place kicked the regime out, captured a couple armored vehicles, took all the weapons, and that really inspired the revolution that happened from there. Let's talk Syrian revolution for a moment, and then we'll talk more about this, because what you're looking at now is I think it was just the 15th year anniversary, right? 2011, 12? I'm bad at math. It kicked off in 2011.
End of 2010, beginning of 2011.
Yeah, 2011. You can do the math.
11 years.
Anyway, the revolution kicked off there, and at the beginning, it was a very, let's use the word secular. The majority of Syrians are brilliant, moderate, not jihadi, not crazy, amazing people. I've totally fallen in love with Syrians in this whole process of working in the different places in Syria we have. When it started in the south, this wasn't like a Allahu Akbar jihad thing. It was the south of Syria is almost entirely Sunni, and you have Assad's regime is an Alawite Shia regime. And so you have a minority, which at the time was about 13% of the population, was overseeing a country of 85% Sunni, which was under the repressive heel of the regime. So when it got kicked off because an incident happened with some kids in Dara, and the parents got mad, and then it started a small protest outside the police station, and then from there it grew and grew and grew, and then it spread all over the country, and the regime started getting kicked out of all of these villages, to where the south was almost completely controlled by opposition forces almost immediately. Within a few months, it was just the whole country was collapsing, and Assad was pulling the regime back into Damascus. And they lost about 85% of the country in a matter of months, which was crazy, which is why everyone was like, Assad's days are numbered. It's going to be over here in a minute. And it's a wonder of wonders that he's still there. It's just crazy. So what happened here is the dynamic changed for the army, and this is how it intersects with our story. We were in Iraq at the time. My family was in Iraq at the time. And I knew that something was happening. The army was doing something on a humanitarian thing, but it was all kind of like Vice News did a thing on it, and it was all kind of hazy. But we kind of kept an eye on it. And so what happened was at the beginning of the revolution, a guy who's now like a brother to me and the reason why I came, at the time was the head of Army Intelligence, who was tasked with coming up with the protocol of how the army would respond to the beginning of the revolution. Because it was really weird at the beginning. Because for decades, the dynamic was you had tanks pointing at tanks, and the Golan Heights was the quietest place in Israel. This is where you come to barbecue and, like, you know, for soldiers, meaning like if you're a soldier in the Golan, you weren't coming and it was hot. It's not like, it wasn't a hot spot. From Yom Kippur up until 2011, this was like peaceful, quiet, calm. There was nothing. And then one day it broke because of what happened in Dara. Now, when that happened, it spread clashing. You could sit up here, and we would come with the kids and picnic on the hills, and you could just watch fighting from here. And you could see like that was controlled by the regime. That was rebel territory. That was controlled by the regime. This was rebel territory. That village was controlled by the regime. That village was rebel territory. So you just watch the villages just exchange fire all day long, and then there'd be big campaigns and then small campaigns. And so as that was happening, the army said, well, what do we do? Because what happens if, you know, a rocket lands in, let's say, one of these agricultural centers? What happens if it lands in a kindergarten in Marom Golan and kills a couple of Israeli students, kids? The army's going to go in there in 2 minutes and occupy it, and a lot of people are going to die. It's going to be very expensive, and it's going to be this horrible thing. So the army said, let's take a strategic decision to reach out to the other side and say, hey guys, we don't really know what's going on. It's your thing. We're not going to get involved. No worries. But here's the deal. If violence spills over on the Israeli side, you guys are going to really regret it because we're going to defend our border. So make sure that nothing happens. So to move the conversation forward, let's do a deal. If you guys agree to try to keep the border safe, we will try to do whatever you need. What do you need? And they said, we need medical assistance and humanitarian aid because the regime's cut off us from the electrical grid, from water. We don't have much food, and we need weapons to fight the regime. We want to overthrow Assad. And the army said, we learned our lesson in Lebanon. We're not going to give you weapons. We're not going to train an army. We're not going to overthrow the regime. It's your thing. And but we'll help you on the humanitarian front, and we'll help you on the medical front. So what Marco did was set up a field hospital. Just there's that mound right there that's kind of cut out with the dirt on it. Just behind there was where the first field hospital was set up for the Syrians. And that became kind of ground zero for the building of what became Operation Good Neighbor, which was a massive multi-billion shekel initiative where every night all of these villages along the border were receiving aid from the Syrian side. Sorry, from the Israeli side. So just to put it in perspective, like armies don't do that. Like armies are violent by nature, they're supposed to be, because it's about security. Armies don't think of ways to like, how do we get diapers into enemy territory? How do we get baby formula into a village that used to be, we thought, was like a big enemy? We thought, and because the Syrians were like, hey, we were told our whole lives that the Zionists were our big enemy, but now our own government's like dropping barrel bombs on us, and the big enemy Israel is coming to ask how they can help. So the Syrian side was like, is this real? And the Israeli side was like, is this real? Are you guys want to be friends? And they were like, do you want to be friends? And then it turned out to be this really beautiful friendship and relationship. Still to this day, like at the end when Assad took control of all these areas in the end, like it was horrible. We had to evacuate all of our people because the US State Department and the Russians actually forced us out, not the Syrians or the Israelis. And because the Russians ended up brokering the ceasefire here. So they disarmed everybody and came in because the opposition wouldn't let the regime in. So the Russians came in and said, we'll put Russian military police inside all of these villages. And because of Russia's relationship with Iran, it was a good kind of go-between. So they came into all these villages, we evacuated, and all the villages were just decimated emotionally because they wanted to become absorbed by Israel. So they were begging the army, would you please occupy our villages and annex it and make it formally part of Israel? And Israel was like, we can't even like build a new apartment complex in East Jerusalem without, a war breaking out. We're not going to be able to annex large swaths of Syrian territory just because you'd rather be Israeli. So that's kind of the story. We came in about 5-6 years ago and then worked here until Assad took control of it. And the border runs up to the top of the Hermon. So the right side of the snow is all Syria, the front side of the snow to the left is Israel, and the back side of the snow is all Lebanon. And that's the lay of the land. There's nothing up here but army bases and wineries. This is all wineries. Great wine up here if anybody likes wine. The Golan has amazing wines, cherries, agriculture, and that's it. and 24,000 Israelis. Think about that. That's like a block of people in Tel Aviv. Like an apartment block is 24,000 Israelis. 24,000 Israelis in the entire Golan Heights. It's so tiny, which is why I love it. I think in terms of ministry, it's an amazing, you can just get lost in the vastness of Tel Aviv. Here it's very like small town Montana or something, So it's a very unique place. That's Syria. And yeah.